Okay, let's just face it. You're a board gamer, you're a roleplay gamer, you're a tabletop gamer. You love miniatures. Why? If you have seen any of my videos that don't have to do with board games, you'll know that I have an obsession with miniatures because I'm a stop-motion animator and I animate small things. But if you're a board gamer and you play things like Scythe, then you might have more of an obsession with miniatures than I do. And if you've ever seen a Cool Mini or Not Kickstarter, then chances are you don't have a life savings anymore. There's just something in these, something that we relate to that draws us to them every time we see them. Something that brings us to miniatures not just because of quality, but because of something we can relate to. It lets us see things on a different scale, but still relative to ourselves. I forgot how heavy this game is. So why is it that I bought multiple expansions for Imperial Assault just to end up pulling all the miniatures out and playing them in the Star Wars role-playing game instead? In fact, I'm using them in a game that doesn't need miniatures at all. And the craziest part about that is that the game comes with its own tokens if you just want to use these instead. You don't have to buy anything. So why did I still buy the Hera expansion just to represent my character? When I was a kid and just getting into role-playing games, my favorite part of D&D was getting all these miniatures, buying the random boxes, and just having all of these incredible figures to represent everything that I loved about the game. And this is insane for a game that doesn't need miniatures. Unless you played 4th edition, of course. I always wanted a character to represent what I was and a monster to represent what I was going up against, to see the difference in what we were. And all of these small representations were just there to trigger my imagination and push it further. But more importantly, I related to them in some way. I wanted to be that person. So in a game like D&D where you don't need miniatures at all to enjoy any part of the game, why do we still love them so much? And the absurdity of all this is that you could just break out your change jar and play a game of Warhammer with quarters and pennies. And a lot of games still come with just wooden blocks and wooden pieces like the original Risk games. Different colors, different shapes will represent different pieces, and you can easily keep track of a game just like this. But then Caverna rears its ugly head again, and it gives you all these tiny sheep meeples and pumpkins and donkeys and pigs, and they're basically just miniatures. And they could have given us white cubes and orange cubes and yellow cubes and brown cubes, but instead they carved them into things. They put all this extra work to carve them into miniature versions of themselves, even though the fact that they look like these animals have nothing to do with the actual game system. This is all just for the player to enjoy. So why do we love that there's a tiny little dog meeple? Wait. What the fuck? Miniatures are something we're so innately attached to. Creating small versions of ourselves. If we create robots, we create them to look like us. It's this obsession with ourselves. But when we create miniatures for board games and for role-playing games, we create monsters, we create other creatures and slimes and dragons and werewolves, and I think those all tie in. We want to have something that we relate to, so that when a dragon gets placed next to a small little human, you can see yourself in that human, and you can see what this giant threat is in front of you. You don't need something insanely huge to represent it. You just need to shrink everything down a bit. Miniatures are incredible because they represent anything you want to be when you're playing a role-playing game. Your body size, your gender, your race, what you look like, what your beliefs are, what your devotions are. And then those get put to the test by placing another miniature next to them. In a similar way, this is how movies work. When you take one scene and you place it next to another one, the importance of those scenes change. So when you take your miniature and you place it next to one that challenges it in some way, then tension is built. A story is created. And while our imaginations are so powerful, having representations to switch up how we see things. When I say a giant dragon runs out in front of you, you see it one way, but if I put this green miniature in front of you, you might think, I didn't expect it to have spikes on its head or it to be so small or green. And then our imaginations work even harder to fill in the blanks of what this would look like next to you. And in board games, believe it or not, we love systems. And so when you see all of these systems running in Caverna, where you have tons of sheep in your field, you can imagine a field with sheep and cows and horses milling about, not a bunch of squares. And when you run a game of Scythe, which just has a bunch of hexes on the board with some mountains and lakes painted on it, and you slam down these giant mechs that all have different sculpts, and all of your character minis have a different animal and are riding them or walking alongside them, you can imagine the movement of this world and how beautiful it can be with all of these creatures interacting in it. And at this point, you might just be thinking that I'm crazy, that miniatures are just higher quality, so we buy them. But we don't buy miniatures just to fulfill the needs of a game. We buy miniatures to flesh out a world that we're trying to create in our minds. We buy miniatures to make a board game better, even if the miniatures don't interact with the game. We buy miniatures to paint them for hours and hours to look like something that we imagined in our mind when we saw the blank canvas. If you go on a Reddit like r-mini painting, you'll see thousands and thousands of different renditions of the same exact miniature. If you look up the Beholder that I showed you before, you will never see the same paint job twice. And that's because everyone thought of that miniature differently. And they all wanted to show their own interpretation of it. So whether you like it or not, I think miniatures are important because, well, we could just be using quarters and colored cubes. We don't. We spend money and time on things that we want to represent the worlds that we can imagine. We love miniatures because we can capture moments in time and reenact other ones. And they push our imaginations further. The unfortunate reality is that I don't actually have an answer for you. What I do know is that it has to be something more than just an appreciation for well-sculpted plastic. I wouldn't spend as much time and money as I have on these tiny little figures if that was all it was. I think we connect to them on some level. And that's why we empty our wallets and flood our tables with all these tiny figurines. However, what I do know is that you can actually buy a few of the minis that I showed in the video today. They're all painted by me and mainly for Dungeons & Dragons or just putting on your shelf. So you can check out my Twitter for that link, or I have a blog that's just dedicated to miniatures that I paint and miniatures that I build. What I do want to know is what you think it is. What makes you buy miniatures? Because I know if you're watching this video, you probably have a shelf of them, and most of them are probably unpainted. If you play Warhammer, you have more than you like to admit, and if you play D&D, you're probably in the same boat as well, actually. So let me know what miniatures are to you. Are they as important as they sound to me, or are they just something that you buy because they come with the game? Do you sit down at a role-playing game and break out a miniature to show everyone what you want to be represented as, what you want to be portrayed as? Or do you paint them and put them on your shelf so you can see all of your creative ideas and be surrounded by legions of your own imagination? Whatever it is, thanks for watching. If you know someone that has a bit of a problem with miniatures like I do, send them the video and they'll probably get a kick out of it, and maybe they'll have a good take on exactly why they like them. But regardless, if you enjoy them, pull them all out and play a game of Dungeons and Dragons with as many miniatures as you can, or play a game of Warhammer where at least some of them are painted, or just sit down and paint one for a few hours tonight. Whatever you do, just next time you pick up a miniature, think about what it means to you. Have a good one.